So I'm going to just keep us going because we wanted this to be really a focus on questions and addressing whatever needs all of you have. I'm going to end with just sort of a few tips for how to have inclusive discussions about LGBTQ topics with other people in your life, in whatever format that might be. So one of the first tips is to share your pronouns and to use the pronouns others use for themselves. As you can see on both of our Zoom windows, we both put our pronouns in after our names, and that signifies that we identify, well, in some way it is a way of sharing our gender identity in a way, in the sense that we both identify with the pronouns she, her. One thing I didn't say when I was talking about gender identity is that people's pronouns correspond often to their gender identity. And typically people who identify as more feminine or female use she, her pronouns. People who identify more with the male binary use he, him pronouns. And then people who don't feel comfortable with that binary in any way, in some way, for any reason, use other pronouns. It's becoming much more common for people to prefer they, them pronouns, because those are pronouns that we are all used to using in some way, and we actually have always used them in a singular way at times. But it's now officially okay with Merriam-Webster even to use they, them as a singular pronoun. But there are other non-binary pronouns that people use, but they, them is the one that I see the most right now. And we can talk about what those pronouns might be if people have questions about it. But the bottom line is that one of the ways to show that you're really inclusive is when you're introducing yourself to new people is to just say, hi, my name is Jess. I use she, her pronouns. And even if the other person doesn't want to share their pronouns, the fact that you've even done that shows that you know and you understand that other people might not use the pronouns that one might assume they use based on looking at them. And you're giving them the space to share what their pronouns are. And then after that happens, it's really important to use those pronouns as much as you can remember to do that. Sorry, Marcie, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I just get all excited. And when you share, because we're in a group with parents, it becomes a model for your children that this is normalizing it. Yeah. And you're teaching your children that this is just part of how we introduce ourselves and part of how we engage in the world. And just like you have to pay attention to the person's name when they introduce themselves and use that when you're referring to them, you also have to pay attention to their pronouns, which is just a beautiful way to build connection and rapport with new people.
Definitely. Another thing to know about pronouns is that, first of all, some people might change their pronouns over time. And sometimes people might even feel like they are comfortable with more than one type of pronoun. I just got a direct message asking if I could explain the pronouns he, they, / him. And that to me signifies that someone who says that or puts that in their Zoom window or whatever means that that person is comfortable with they, them pronouns and he, him pronouns, and either one is fine. So a lot of people might introduce themselves as using multiple types of pronouns, and then you can use whichever ones you feel comfortable with that they said was fine.
And also along those lines, if you are unsure, if you've introduced yourself with your pronouns, someone shares their pronouns, and you have a question about what will make them most comfortable, ask from a place of compassion and kindness, and they'll let you know.
Yeah. And even just the question to ask is, what are your pronouns? And what would you like me to call you? Or what name do you prefer to be called? Because that's the way to sort of communicate that you respect this person as an individual and you want to address them in the way that most feels most comfortable for them. The next tip is really not to make assumptions about other people's gender, sexual orientation, family configuration, and so on, that we can just ask questions. Tell me about your family. How do you identify? Especially when we're talking about families and kids, not necessarily asking kids, who are your grown-ups? And which is your what you say, right, Marcie? Instead of saying, who are your mom and dad? even if you're, talking to a child who is talking to you at the playground or something like that. And then that way we're not making assumptions that they have both a mom and a dad, or even necessarily that they're being raised by their parents and not some other person. So we want to just that's where also asking people about their pronouns is also part of the picture, because we're not making assumptions about someone's gender when we ask them what their pronouns are.
And also when you're meeting other parents, not asking them where their husband is or where their wife is, but where's your partner, or are you co-parenting with somebody? Mm-hmm. So having that openness with the adults as well as the kids.
Definitely. Another tip when working with, especially with LGBT parents, is to not ask intrusive questions that you wouldn't ask people who are heterosexual and cisgender. In polite conversation, you would never ask someone else about their genitalia, about surgeries they've had on different parts of their body, how their children were conceived, unless you're, already very close to someone and you're, bonding about trying to get pregnant. Those are not questions that we would normally ask people. And even if you're curious about sort of how a family that is LGBT that you're meeting was developed, or like how it was created, wait at the very least until you have the kind of relationship with those people where it's appropriate to ask those kinds of questions. But one of the things that happens a lot for LGBT people is that one of the first questions they get is some intrusive questions about things like, especially for gender non-conforming people or transgender people, asking about body parts or what they're, what kind of surgery they've had or something like that. And for parents who have same-sex parents, or parents where one parent is trans, families where one parent is transgender, how did you have your kids is one of the first questions that often people get asked. That can be very off-putting and feels uncomfortable, because that's not why we're getting together to meet each other, unless we're in a infertility group or something.
Yeah. And know that your kids might ask intrusive questions because they're curious and because they don't know right and wrong of social norms. And so that's also part of A, what you want to be modeling, and B, if your child does, don't wait for the person to answer because you were curious too. Like, model for them of, we're not going to ask that question. They have amazing children and that's great. Mm-hmm. Help them through that, but mm-hmm. also that make sure that this becomes part of the conversation you have with them when you're talking about these are things that are personal and private, and we don't ask people, and these are things that we can ask people, mm-hmm. right? You can ask another 5-year-old how old they are, but you're not going to ask a 45-year-old how old they are. So when you're going through those kind of lessons with your children, make sure to include around gender, around identity, around family makeup, so they start to think about what would feel good for me to ask, what is okay for me to know, and what's private that I want to make sure that person feels good in our conversations.
Definitely. I want to say yes to all of what Marcie just said, and also don't freak out if your kids do ask those kinds of questions. It's not something to overly apologize for, because the bottom line, I'm going to skip one and go down to apologize when you make mistakes, because we all make mistakes. We're all learning in this, and it's totally normal for kids to ask these kinds of questions because they're just figuring out the world. And a lot of times when kids ask these questions, it doesn't feel uncomfortable, and you can let people answer to the extent that they feel comfortable. And if they want to say, that's private information that we only share with people that we know very well, then that's okay. Or if they share the details, then or give some kind of answer that provides some kind of response, like, our kids don't have a dad, they have a donor, then sort of follow the other parent's lead. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is just that you want to let other people come out on their own terms and show people support and acceptance no matter what. I'm thinking about that specifically if you are a parent or adult to someone who is beginning the coming out process of figuring out their gender identity or their sexual orientation. The best thing to do in that situation is to just say, I'm here to talk about it, and I'm here to support you no matter what it is that you want to talk about. And, as you figure things out, keep me posted. And I'll, as much as I can help, talking to me might help you figure things out. I'm fine. I'm happy to do that as well. And it's really just a matter of saying, I'm here no matter what, and I love you no matter what.
And along with that, as a parent, you might have different feelings. You might not be wholehearted, open, and accepting if your child comes and tells you something about their gender identity or sexual orientation. And that's okay. What I would recommend is that you find a safe place for you to process those feelings and those emotions, and you find a way to make peace with your own beliefs and your own feelings. And when your child is in front of you, you support them and you let them know that they are loved, that you care about them. You can be curious and ask them questions of things you don't know, but in front of your child, you want to make sure that they know they are loved. And you find your own personal space to process your feelings and emotions because they are yours. And it's not about denying that. It's about having the right place for each response. Yes. And the best kind of national resource for parents and relatives of people who are lesbian or gay or trans is PFLAG, PFLAG, which has lots of support groups for parents and friends of LGBT people.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, and maybe you'll get to it after, but I'd like to bring it up so we don't lose sight.
Oh, yeah.
So Serena and Sean Sultan are asking if there are children's books, perhaps for a child around age 5 or so, that they could start to begin introducing gender and LGBTQ plus, like the notion of this. Do you guys have any recommendations? And I'll put those in the chat as well, so we can all share those.
I will have to, I don't remember I have a lot of 2 mom books, there's one called Mommy, Mama, and Me, which is like a tiny board book for really little ones. And other, like the Todd Parr, the family book is really great because it talks about all different kinds of families. It's not specifically about gender and sexual orientation. There are a bunch of lists out there of LGBTQ books for little kids. And I don't have a link to that website off the top of my head, but I can find it and pass it on to Jessica, so that way she can post it with the materials on the CUNYC website with the video of this session.
Thank you, Dr. Jess.
Yeah, no
problem. I would
problem.
also encourage you to look at board games and TV shows and movies
and talk about it. Because there are so many places where the heteronormative conversation is coming forward. There are so many more examples of heterosexual families with a mom and a dad that you want to make sure you are creating lots of opportunities for your kids to see variability and possibility so that they can grow up with openness in all of the ways. Definitely.
Guys, there are a couple of folks on the call are sharing some websites with us with early literature.
Oh, thank you.
Childhood books. So if anyone else would like to look on there. Yeah, great. I love when everyone comes together. Perfect.
Yeah. The last thing I'll just say before I turn off the screen sharing is just that LGBTQ families are more similar to non-LGBTQ families that are cisgender and heterosexual, than they are different. We still struggle with bedtime, and, being queer is a very small part of my parenting experience. I can speak for myself. It comes up occasionally, but most of the time, the things that I deal with as a parent are the same things that everyone else deals with. I guess, don't worry that things are going to be so different for this other family, or if your family is shifting, because family issues are family issues, and family experiences are family experiences. And it can add a level of stress or strain at times, especially if people are in an environment that isn't accepting in some way. But the day-to-day logistics are very similar.